If you drive a then you could have been a victim of this hacker's exploit.
Yeah, so I had just been working on this bug bounty program for some time. I was just spending time on the program and I just stumbled across this massive vulnerability. I wasn't necessarily looking for this specific outcome per se, but stumbled across some misconfigurations and had a great time exploiting it for some pretty good impact.
How much of this was like manual testing? How much of it was automated? Like, what was the process like?
Yes, this was all manual testing that was done. I used some reconnaissance data that I had done. So I've actually turned that into certs.io, if you see that. But I had been doing scans of the internet and came across an interesting host and then went from there and did everything manually. Yeah.
So the automation part or the recon part was mostly just getting the asset discovery, and then you did content discovery and like these endpoints that you found manually.
So yeah, I started with looking for TLS certificates on the actual internet that have been previously seen. So a trick is that you might use Subfinder or a mask to find subdomains, and then you would just try to resolve those and go that route. There's another way where you can go the opposite route, where you look for servers that have a TLS certificate with a domain name in that's related to your target. So this is kind of how I did it using the certs.io command line tool that you can try out. So it'd be like certs.io search domain example.com. You could search it and it would like have a bunch of certificates that are dumped out. And in there, I found one that had a asterisk in it, which is an indicator for it has a wildcard certificate. So it matches a lot of subdomains or names under that star. So I guess we can take a look at this specific CTF.io, or just this HackingHub lab. So we will launch this.
When you say you were doing certificate transparency searches, you just pretty much scanning the entire internet, grabbing the certificate, pulling the common name or the cert name or whatever else you go through, and then just putting it in a database. And then you pull that and you look for the actual host that matches that. But in this case, it was just a wildcard. Okay.
Yep. So it's just a wildcard. And that's always interesting to me because it doesn't have one name that's just, attached to that. It just means like when I see the asterisk, a lot of times I think it's a load balancer and ingress endpoint. So companies will have one load balancer that routes to a bunch of different microservices. Some of them maybe aren't supposed to be externally facing, and sometimes you can route to them. And so that's why I like targeting those. And that's why I look for those certificates or assets that have a certificate that has a wildcard in the common name. When I visited it, I got this response where it just says backend IP not found. And it actually reflected the, instead of IP, it reflected whatever I sent in the host header. So if I sent like ASDF, it would say backend.asdf not found. So I don't know if this necessarily does that. But what's interesting here is that when you send a different host header, it changes the response. I typically try to do virtual host enumeration from there. So I will take this and we can use fuff. We can do -h host fuzz dot. And notice that here we're replacing this asterisk with just fuzz because that's what we want to brute force down. And so I will use a custom word list. You can use asset note. This is a really good word list that you can use. It's even better than what I have. It's just his best DNS word list. This thing is massive. So we can try this and notice that we get a bunch of responses. We can filter this out now using -w. We want to filter by words. You can filter by size, lines. But basically, since, these don't really exist and you get a 200 every single response, you want to filter them out and see what actually responds differently. So we will.
So what you're essentially doing here is you're looking for a different behavior based on the word that it's fuzzing in the virtual host. And based on that behavior, so for example, if a 404 comes, it's not your typical 200, then you go, oh, there's something here. I wonder what it is. And then you're going to, fuzz it in for looking for content or something else, right?
Yes, exactly. So it's just noticing different responses. So, like for instance, you see this PL80, whatever, you send that host, you get a 500 internal server error, and you get that like not found error. And then say we put this definitely doesn't exist, you get a 200, you get a content length of 670, and you see all this stuff.
Yeah.
And let's
So in
try
this
like adding
case,
FFFFF. You also get that same response, so that also doesn't exist. But this is interesting behavior.
so in this case, that GitHub one is an interesting one because of the fact that it's coming up 404 instead of a 200 or 500, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you enter GitHub and you say, "Whoa, this is interesting." We'll see what else comes up. I actually hope I have this subdomain in this word list I used. So actually, I just realized this. This is a rabbit hole I went down originally too. Is I found this GitHub host, and as you see here in GitHub, I had GitHub, and I did find an enterprise server, GitHub enterprise server, when I originally found this. And so this indicates already that this is some sort of load balancing or an ingress endpoint. So I then looked closer at the certificate. And so as you can see here, we have the original asset that we found. But if you go look at the certificate, you see it actually has a common name for star.apps. So what I did next is I brute forced down that to do. Again, I'm replacing this asterisk with fuzz.
So now you're
And
enumerating on under apps because the asset itself is also pointing into a wildcard under apps itself, right?
yes, exactly. You have this host, and we did find GitHub, and I couldn't find anything else down just Word. I looked at the certificate, and it turns out it also has star.app. So a lot of times it might be like word.word dot the asset you're brute forcing for. A lot of times this can be like apps, it can be QA, it can be prod, it can be like K8s. So it
Mm.
helps to fuzz recursively down the host header for assets. And I don't know if I have this necessarily in the word list I have, but I think it's configurator prod was the host I ended up brute forcing. I'm just going to stop the FF so I don't, destroy all your infrastructure.
Yeah, for the
But
sake of the video, we're gonna stop it so we don't let it go a
yeah.
million wordless down the road. But so the
Yes.
moral of the story was the moral of the story is you find us, you find a domain through that domain's asset, or through that asset itself, you find a certificate that points you to another one, and then you brute force it down. Takes 20 minutes, 30 minutes later, you find configurator prod.apps domain.com.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, exactly. And so when I hit this, I just got I started using FF to brute force down this, and as you can see here, oftentimes it can be like actuator /
Yeah.
and then you get this sort of response. Other times you might just get it like this on the base path. I've seen this lots of times as well. So I had brute force and did see actuator. In this case, you don't need to do that. So I tried posting to /env. So with oftentimes you can, so yeah, you can see Space Raccoon has like a GitHub repository on how you can do this, but most of the times you can just make a post request to the env endpoint, and basically what it does is it loads it depends on the version of Spring Boot, but you can either load a remote jar and then basically just get code execution, or this one uses the database aliases. This one's pretty cool too. So it depends on the version of Spring Boot that's running, but with the env endpoint, you can usually get RCE. For this one, I could not because it required me to load a jar from my external host, and they had outbound firewall rules, so you couldn't make HTTP requests outside of the network, which was unfortunate.
But the
But there's
good
also
news
another,
is,
yeah.
yeah, but the good news is you have the heap dump, right?
Yep, exactly. And so the heap dump is a snapshot of everything that's in memory at a given time. So you can see that this is a heap dump, and I will save this to my server. So we'll do wget.
So people that are watching this and they've never done this, actually with a heap dump, when you have that snapshot, there is a bunch of really, it's a gold mine pretty much, right? You can find credentials, you can see secure, like some of the headers have been sent. If there's a bearer token in the header, you can get it. You can look for secrets. I've seen some really crazy stuff in a heap dump.
We have this. I also had looked at this env endpoint, and as you can see, here's one of the flags for the HackingHub. But in the endpoint, it dumps some environment variables, I guess all of the environment variables for the application. And so as you can see here, we have this Spring Cloud config URI, a client ID, client secret, access token URI. So this is interesting to me, but there was never anything in that environment that immediately stood out to me, nothing super juicy right off the bat. So a lot of times these values will be redacted if they're a password, if they're private key. It's up to the developer to configure how they want to redact these environment variables in this env endpoint. Yeah, so oftentimes if it is redacted, you can do what I did and save that heap dump. You can run strings on it to grep for secrets. You can also use a tool called JHat to look through all of them and query for objects in there, and I highly recommend that. But in this case, we can just hit the env endpoint. It actually dumps this client secret and all this other interesting data. As you can see, there's nothing that's redacted that we need to grep for. So going back to this is my mind when I'm trying to exploit this bug is, okay, there's nothing really on this specific host, but what is this Spring Cloud config URI? And what is this client ID, client secret, and what's this access token thing for? So I then used the same exact host that we were already targeting, and I tried just sending a new host or a new request with this host header, the value that I found in spring.cloud config URI. So I tried virtual hosting to that, and as you can see, it worked. You are able to hit it, but you're given a unauthorized error. This is interesting to me. I wanted to figure out how I can actually authorize to this API. And guess what? What do you know? Look right here. You can also use the client ID and client secret and this access token URI endpoint to authenticate to this cloud config URI. So we vhost to this. The endpoint is OAuth /access token. We need to post to it. Grant type client credentials, client. Oh. So this is just, you need to know how to use or how OAuth works. I guess I'm showing you usually the parameters that most of these requests take. So you give the client ID, and then we take the client secret, and I think it should be.
So at this point, you're pretty much pivoting from one host, another host, all through the same, to just virtual hosts, right?
Load balancer. Yep. So none of these hosts resolved externally, but you could just send them in the host header and you could still access them. So basically, I'm pivoting from configurator prod. Then I take the client ID and the client secret I found in this environment endpoint. I take the access token URI. So I'm pivoting to that next, and I'm sending these things that we found to get an access token to pivot to this config server that we cannot yet access. So as you can see, the client ID and client secret are valid. And so you can take this access token, and this is a JWT. You can usually tell just by seeing the EY at the beginning. So I take that. You can do authorization, bearer, and then I paste it there. And as you can see, it's another Spring Boot actuator host.
But this one was behind authentic. This one needed you to be authenticated this time, so you couldn't just access it without authentication. But
yep.
Wow.
Yep. So that was also funny to me is, okay, they did have some layer of security there. It required authentication, but since you could use the first bug to leak the client credentials, you could generate an access token to pivot to another vulnerable internal server. So going to this env endpoint again, you can see that here's a the environment variables. So we have source URI, and you can see it's GitHub. It has the username. It's just a URL to a Git repo. And then we have source username, which is presumably the username for the GitHub enterprise server. And then as you can see, like I was saying earlier, passwords are often redacted, right? So you have this star.
And this is the GitHub asset that you found earlier in the video.
Yes.
So we found this already. We knew it existed.
Exactly. So we knew this already existed. Now figure out what this password is so we can authenticate to this GitHub instance and get access to, code.
Yeah. So you send that same request on your third tab, you authenticate yourself, pull the heap dump this time, and then you use strings pretty much to get the GitHub password, and then you can pretty much authenticate to GitHub.
Exactly. And so as you can see here, we have a heap dump. So now we can do wget, and this time we will use, this host header. We'll use this authentication header, the authorization header, and then we can do strings. Oops. No, that didn't work. I need to search for, if we go back to the env endpoint, we want to grep for source password. As you can see, we have source password now.
Wow.
So now we know the username is gops and the password is that. Now, I guess you want to verify whether or not you can actually access the GitHub server with the credentials. Is API v1 user?
It's API v3.
Yes, it is. So if you look at the GitHub documentation, you can look through the APIs. And so the API v3-user is just an endpoint that returns the user with the credentials you send. So we will do authorization basic this time because it's username and password. We know the username is gops and the password is this string.
And if people that are watching this, that this is where reading the freaking manual always helps. This is actually public information on GitHub's website. All you have to do is just go read through it. If you find the credentials to someone's GitHub, same way you can authenticate on GitHub. It's just this is the enterprise GitHub that this company had internally for themselves that Corbin just got access to with their credentials from the heap dump.
So as you can see, the credentials work, and you have the flag here. But in the real world scenario, I had access to this GitHub user through the username and password. So even better, I could go to, I set in my Etsy hosts file, I did like this, the IP of this server, and set the host name to like github.company.com. And it actually loaded their GitHub enterprise instance. So I could just go to the login page, enter these credentials as well, and just log in and browse every single repository. There was over 300 something repositories I had read-write access to. It was really, really bad.
So essentially what you could do with this, Corbin, correct me if I'm wrong, you could commit code, change code, deploy things, lots of crazy things you shouldn't be able to do.
Yep. So we're talking websites, APIs, firmware for vehicles, mobile apps. It was an over privileged user that had access to a variety of applications used in a variety of places.
So moral of the story is you find a certificate that you can't directly hit it through the DNS record, find some IP associated with it because somehow that DNS record was collected, right? So somewhere out there you have access to that potentially. You just have to figure out where it goes.
Exactly. So you might have an interesting domain name that you find in Subfinder, but that host doesn't resolve. It's worth looking on certs.io, looking at Census, looking at Shodan to see if a web server is open that has that certificate attached to it. Because it might not resolve to that IP, but if that IP is still there, you can likely access applications for that host or under that host header.
I don't know. I feel like that was a really cool hack, from doing things like recon, virtual host scanning, and going through a heap dump, all the way through finding authorization keys through using OAuth. I felt that was a really, really cool way to hack into a large manufacturer. I don't know. You tell me, do you like this kind of content? Do you want me to bring more hackers and have them show you some of their bugs, some of their favorite findings, and tell you about them? You tell me. Drop me a comment and let me know. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Peace.